Please do débat. The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to begin by commending my colleague from the NDP for bringing this bill. It is a welcome contribution to a very comprehensive problem, a very large problem in Canadian society today, and that is the use of rail in Canada, our railway system, in its fullest context. That is to say, passenger rail service, freight rail service, commuter rail systems, the whole question of our rail system in Canada, which is, I believe, very much in play. I'm pleased to follow up my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister, in terms of his remarks. And I'd like to begin by also saying that, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the question of Via Rail and its future, I have concluded, watching this government now for 9 years, watching many of its frontline ministers for a decade previously while they served in another right-wing government, that the government's intention in due course is to attempt to privatize Via Rail. Now, when I began speaking this way several years ago about Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, Conservative members scoffed. They dismissed it. They said it was alarmist. They said it was trying to frighten people. But of course we know, Mr. Speaker, that the government followed the regular pattern that it does when it wants to divest itself of a Crown asset. And this is how it goes. And this is what they did with Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. As far as I'm concerned, this is what the government's beginning to do now with respect to Via Rail. In the context of Atomic Energy, the Prime Minister dispatched his then Director of Communications to give a series of, make a series of remarks, public remarks, about the state of that Crown Corporation. And it was very disturbing to the thousands and thousands of Canadians who had helped build AECL to make it, after 58 years, one of the world's leading global nuclear research companies, as well as nuclear power plant companies, as well as isotope producing companies, medical isotope producing companies. But they went out and they ran it down and they called it a sinkhole, and they began their pattern of running down an asset before, of course, they sold it at fireside prices. 58 years of global tradition. Canadian leadership sold it for $100 million to SNC-Lavalin. This is what they do. And so today I am having this conversation, I am making these remarks in the context of my conclusion that the government fully intends, if it is re-elected, to divest itself of Via Rail and to move in the same direction with respect to Canada Post. We see the same techniques, the same kinds of actions being taken. And we've just heard similar remarks from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport, which is unfortunate, because Canadians have come to depend on passenger rail. They really have come to depend on passenger rail as a part of their tradition, as a part of what they need, as a part of their economy, whether it's the use of passenger trains, for example, for hunting and other eco-tourist opportunities in northern Quebec, whether it is for passenger use in and around Sarnia, whether it is, as my colleague mentioned, the use of rail on Vancouver Island. There is a present demand for passenger rail in this country. Now, he's gone a certain distance, my colleague has in his bill, to make some recommendations for change, and I commend him for actually stepping up to the plate and recommending anything that might improve Via Rail. I don't agree with all of the measures, of course, and I think there's an element of perhaps being too highly prescriptive, which may or may not fit more readily in the tradition of the NDP's view of how to manage a Crown Corporation. But I do commend him for making some positive recommendations for change. There are, however, larger questions looming that I want to come back to, something I mentioned just a minute ago. Right now in our rail system, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian rail system is basically bottlenecked. This bill is deposited here on the floor today in the context of a major problem. We have too many demands for the rail system as it is presently constructed. Given existing rail capacity, given the existing status of our railways, that is the rail itself, given the fact that we built our cities around the railways, which we never contemplated when we tried to unite this country a century or more ago using rail, what we have is a bottlenecked situation. And it's being made worse by the fact that we have seen a massive increase, a 1,500% increase in the transportation of oil and fossil fuels by rail over the last several years, 2 or 3 years only. And as I like to remind my colleagues regularly, Mr. Speaker, if we build every pipeline that the government's been contemplating now for a decade, which is a pipeline south, a pipeline west, and a pipeline east, even if those three pipelines were built and were carrying fossil fuel, they would, of course, we would still be having made.
Or the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Transport is rising on a point of order.
Yeah, just to the point of relevance, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate we're talking about passenger rail, not pipelines and oil by rail. I know the member is experienced when it comes to debate. He knows the rules of this House, and he should probably be instructed to at least stick to the matter before this Parliament currently. Thank you.
No, the Honourable Member for Ottawa South will want to make reference to the bill for the House, and he has about 3.5 minutes to conclude his remarks.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. But only this parliamentary secretary doesn't understand the connection between the transportation of fossil fuels and passenger rail in Canada. I mean, what is he talking about, Mr. Speaker? This is exactly the problem we're facing in Canada. It's a denial by Conservatives that we have a problem on the ground in the competition for the use of rail between passenger rail and other forms of rail use. What doesn't he understand about that, Mr. Speaker? The problem, Mr. Speaker, is this. The problem is we're going to have, by 2024, 1 million barrels a day of excess capacity of oil being produced, and it's going to be shoved onto the railway system. And the problem is, of course, the government doesn't want to have an adult conversation about that and the fact that it is having a spillover effect as the parliamentary secretary hoots and hollers and continues to yell from his side because he doesn't want to have a real conversation about what's really happening on the ground, which is we have a logjam. We have $3 billion last year lost revenue to our farmers in the Canadian prairies because ships were sitting off the coast of BC because this government couldn't get that grain to market. So this bill is important, and passenger rail, an adult discussion about passenger rail is very important in the context of what choices we're going to make as a country. Now, as I said earlier, some of the measures in the bill are highly prescriptive. For example, when he talks about holding only to the tourism and or the FCM as a source of directors for the corporate board of VIA, I don't think that that's comprehensive, and perhaps not realistic. I think the member might have his own views in that regard as well. When it comes to saying that Via Rail should take precedence in terms of use of track over all other forms of track, all other forms of rail use, I'd like to hear more about that. I'd like to hear more about that from our private sector operators. I'd like to hear more about that from our urban transit systems to see what the distributive effects of such a measure, if implemented, would have on an already bottlenecked system. So I think it's a good contribution to a much larger question about where we're going in this country for the next century, not for the next 6 months, as the Conservatives would have us do because they are fixated on October 19th, not on solving longer-term problems, but their fixation on this election is actually leading to poor public policy outcomes. There's a discussion we need to have here, this bill will help us have it, about where we're going with rail for the next century. That's an important conversation for us to have. It's our responsibility as legislators, on behalf of all Canadians, to treat this responsibly over a longer term. And again, I think that this bill goes some distance in raising questions. And I think he's done a good job as well when it comes to the whole idea of actually having specific legislation that would govern. Let's begin by beginning. And it's a good beginning to have a legislative framework that actually embraces this. The question embraces Via Rail. The question of whether, as I said earlier, Via should be coming back to this House in terms of its internal management decisions, winding up a route here, or cutting back on staff there, or changing the frequency. That's a discussion I think we should have in committee. We will be supporting, Mr. Speaker, sending this to committee to have a more fulsome discussion. Thank you very much.